From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew. Donald Trump refuses to rule out using military or economic force to take control of Greenland and the Panama Canal. The president-elect making the remarks in a more than hour-long news conference today at Mar-a-Lago, in which he also described the Canadian border as an artificial line. We'll be joined by Democratic Congressman Jake Auchincloss of Massachusetts and by MacGuineas at the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, as Trump also pledges to avoid defaulting on our debt. President Jimmy Carter's remains arriving at the U.S. Capitol as we speak, where a memorial service is currently getting underway. He will lie in state beginning later tonight, and we'll have much more ahead with our political panel. Thank you for joining us on the Tuesday edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio. President-elect Trump will not be sworn into office for another 13 days. But he drove the news cycle today with a more than hour-long news conference that hit on many topics, from a possible hostage deal in the Middle East to taking control of Greenland and the Panama Canal, and others you may not have had on your bingo card, like changing the name of the Gulf of Mexico.
We're going to be announcing at a future date pretty soon. We're going to change, because we do most of the work there and it's ours. We're going to be changing, sort of the opposite of Biden, where he's closing everything up, essentially getting rid of $50 to $60 trillion worth of assets. We're going to be changing the name of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, which has a beautiful ring that covers a lot of territory. The Gulf of America, what a beautiful name.
We're not sure how exactly that would work. And joining us is Bloomberg's Hadriana Lowenkron, covering the Trump transition from West Palm Beach. Hadriana, it's good to see you. We heard a lot of ideas today from the president-elect. How much of this was planned, and how serious is he about literally taking over Greenland and the Panama Canal?
Well, there definitely weren't a lot of specifics provided in terms of a lot of stuff. And, our team is kind of speaking, reporting out with some just experts in this space. And they're all also, the big question, will this happen? Will it won't? We're still a couple weeks out. And who knows what could come in terms of these day one executive orders that we are on high alert for. But what really can be seen as a big takeaway here is the extent to which the foreign policy appears to, or seems to be, will be taken to the next level here in this term, even from his prior term. Now, on the campaign trail, of course, there was a lot of focus on the domestic policy, but what we're seeing here, just what seems to be this willingness of him to threaten U.S. allies with coercion if they're unwilling to bend to some of his demands. This is really taking things to a greater step. So that'll be something, of course, that we will be focusing on with this term.
Mm-hmm. I just want to focus quickly on what's happening right now inside the U.S. Capitol Rotunda, where the remains of Jimmy Carter are now being brought into the room. You can see the crowd that is assembled, and we're going to be seeing a memorial service take place here a short time from now, after the horse-drawn caisson brought Carter's remains to the Capitol from the U.S. Navy Memorial on Pennsylvania Avenue. If we can see that shot of the floor, that platform that his casket will be put on is the same catafalque that bore Abraham Lincoln following his assassination in 1865. This is something that we're very good at in Washington. Starting at 7 o'clock tonight, the public will be able to file into the rotunda and pay respects as Jimmy Carter lies in state for the next 2 days, his funeral at the National Cathedral coming up on Thursday. Hadriana Lowenkron again with us in West Palm Beach as we consider the language that we heard today in Donald Trump's news conference and some of the ideas that he shared. Hadriana, he clearly doesn't seem to have a preference, for instance, about the congressional agenda. With our eyes on Congress here, he was asked if it's one big beautiful bill or a couple of different swings at reconciliation when it comes to the border and Trump tax cuts. Does he care?
We still have no idea. And more importantly, Congress has no idea. This is something that, with the Speaker of the House, who was just reelected, as well as the on the Senate side, such a back and forth here about whether it makes sense to have one or two. Obviously, with the economy being important and the debt ceiling, as well as, of course, immigration, which could be the benefit to getting a second win there if it were a two-part. So again, that's something that we're trying to figure out. And Trump has kind of flip-flopped before, saying different things. So this is something that we're hoping at some point there will be some more clarity on to really move things forward.
I'm guessing you and leadership on Capitol Hill. Hadriana, thank you. As always, posted up in West Palm Beach for us as Donald Trump prepares, of course, 13 days from now to be sworn into office. With me now as well at the table, a special guest here in Washington. That would be Bloomberg's own David Gura, who's here for a series of interviews and special coverage of Jimmy Carter's funeral, host of the Big Take podcast. Great to see you in town.
Good to see you as well.
Welcome back to what I know is your former hometown as well. You've been covering Donald Trump from the campaign through the transition and to now on essentially the eve of his inauguration. And the big argument is, as we've heard from many times, do you take him seriously or do you take him literally? With some of these ideas like taking over sovereign countries, what should be people's approach to understand what he's talking about?
Well, Hadriana is talking about how lawmakers don't know what move he wants to make or wants them to make. And I think you can kind of translate that to what we saw at that press conference today. It was supposed to be a press conference with just a major economic announcement, of course, ballooned into this hour-long digression into all of these different things. But I was struck by the way that he brought these up was with an element of seriousness. He wasn't joking about it. And there are things that have bubbled up over the course of these last few weeks. He's talked an awful lot about the Panama Canal. He continues to talk about Greenland. So I guess one wonders how seriously he's taking in terms of what practically he could do. You joke about sort of how he could change the name of the Gulf of Mexico, aside from getting a Rand McNally atlas and changing it himself with a Sharpie. But it does seem to set some markers for certainly his colleagues in the Republican Party and others to sort of follow and wonder where he intends to take it.
There's a thing called promises kept when we cover campaigns here. We're kind of in this weird zone between campaign promises and actual governing. As he gets closer to the White House, do these ideas begin to soften? Is this the opening salvo in a negotiation, as we always hear?
It's an opening salvo, and I'm not saying anything novel here, but he is able to speak and ramble and expound on all of this without really any kind of compliment from the current president in the White House.
Yeah.
It seems like he's taking up a lot of oxygen and being able to advance a lot of these ideas. So they take on weight and import as a result of that. There's nothing really coming up against them. And so you're right, here we are 13 days out. He's going to be the president. I guess I'm reluctant to say that it's kind of being distilled into any kind of clear policy agenda for him when he gets there, but it is the thing that we are talking about, we broadly, and I think that he's relishing that, and there's a degree of familiarity that we recognize from the first time he was in office. He's able to set and scuttle the agenda as he wants, and here we are again.
Drive the news cycle that seems to thrive on this style of communicating. As I mentioned, David Gura, you're here in part to help us cover the funeral of Jimmy Carter. You're going to co-anchor our special coverage. He'll be, of course, at the National Cathedral. He's going to be lying in state beginning tonight in the U.S. Capitol, where his remains have just arrived. This is a special moment for our capital and for our country. Donald Trump actually referred to Jimmy Carter several times, not always in the most flattering light today.
There is this odd historical resonance, so we're joking about the Panama Canal, but this was a signal achievement of the Carter presidency.
That's true.
He was able to broker this treaty with Panama, that by 1999 it would be handed over officially to Panama, and the U.S. could continue to use it in perpetuity. So it is eerie in a way that it's coming up in this fashion at this moment in time. I was thinking, too, just about Carter's legacy and what he was able to do. I mean, he was very proud of the fact that when he was governor and president of the United States, he did a lot to streamline government in both the state of Georgia and the United States as well. So I'm not drawing a direct analogy to Doge and the work that Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy are doing now, but he did bring corporate leaders to the governor's mansion in Georgia, tasked them with, over the course of his governorship, making the government of Georgia much smaller and work more effectively. He did that when he was in the White House as well. So there is an element of historical resonance there. But as you say, this is such a special moment. It's rare that you get a funeral like this in the United States. And I echo what you say completely. This city, this country does it very well. There's a lot of pomp and circumstance and tradition here that's very hard to look away from. Well,
that's right, and it's happening before our eyes now as the chaplain gets this memorial service underway. In the rotunda, he will be memorialized, Jimmy Carter memorialized in this service by Jen-Hsun, the incoming, of course, Senate Majority Leader, by the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, and by Vice President Kamala Harris, who is there as well with lawmakers members of the Carter family and dignitaries. We'll have more on this for you, of course, later today and as we make our way through the week. Big thanks to David Gura for being with us in Washington, D.C. this week. And make sure to tune into his interview with Gary Gensler, chair of the SEC, tomorrow at 12 p.m. Eastern Time on the early edition of Balance of Power. We'll have that for you right here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Coming up, a look at what Donald Trump had to say about the debt ceiling with Maya MacGuineas, president of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I'm okay with spending cuts. I like spending cuts. I'm on the record for spending cuts. And the debt ceiling was given to us. It shouldn't have been, but it was put in our lap. And what I want in terms of debt ceiling isn't the ceiling. I just don't want to see a default. That's all I want. I never talked about spending more money necessarily than all I want to see is no default. Because nobody knows what would happen if there was a default. It could be 1929 and it could be nothing.
Donald Trump in a news conference at Mar-a-Lago earlier today, the president-elect clearly addressing the debt ceiling, which, remember, he asked Congress to deal with in all the drama leading up to the end of the year continuing resolution to fund the government. Congress ended up doing nothing. And so it is going to be in Donald Trump's lap as we head for the ceiling this year. And joining us is Maya MacGuineas, the president of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Maya, it's great to have you back on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm trying to understand the essence of what Donald Trump meant by that. He said what he wants in terms of the debt ceiling isn't the ceiling. He just doesn't want to see a default. So how about we do away with this ridiculous conversation every couple of years and just get rid of it?
Well, I'm not quite there, actually, and here's the reason why. We need to replace the debt ceiling with something else, but it is actually the only fiscal constraint that exists out there. It's the only thing that pushes the pause button and forces Congress to decide what they're going to do because they are limited in how much they're borrowing. Like if they pass a budget, which they almost never do, there's no restraint on how much they borrow in that budget. There are no other real limitations that they ever comply with. There's something called statutory pay-go. They plowed right through it. They didn't even notice at the end of last year. So the debt ceiling is like the one speed bump into borrowing into oblivion. But as President Trump correctly said, it's too risky. We can't risk a default. So I agree with him that we should increase it. I'm not there on getting rid of it unless we replace it. But the one thing that I wish he would say, and this is the point that all of the fiscal conservatives who are talking about, oh, I'm never voting for a debt ceiling increase, should focus on is, how about they make a plan to not pass any legislation that has more borrowing, right? If they like spending cuts, if they think that the fiscal situation is bad, which it absolutely is, there should be an agreement by the Republicans right now, or by all lawmakers, honestly, of no new borrowing.
Let's hear from the Speaker of the House on this. Mike Johnson talked about his chamber's plans, Maya, for the debt limit and reconciliation and how they'll come together in this 119th Congress. Listen.
The intention is to handle the debt limit in reconciliation in the process. And that way, as the Republican Party, the party in charge of both chambers, we then get to determine the details of that. If it runs through regular order and regular process and as a standalone or as part of the appropriations, for example, then you have to have both parties negotiating. And we feel like we're in better stead to do it ourselves. So there is a broad range of opinion on that in our own conference, and we are working through that.
Okay, Maya, so regular order's out the window already. Is he right? Should this be handled in one massive reconciliation bill?
I think that's more of a political question than a policy question. From the policy perspective, I think reconciliation has tended and was intended to be used to reduce the deficit, and more recently it's been used to increase it. So I think from a policy perspective, they should go back and use it for deficit reduction. From a political angle, I would guess this is going to end up actually being two separate bills just because there's so many things going on. They have to fund the government in just a few months. They have to deal with whatever they want in reconciliation, tax cuts, and or the border, but also to what extent they're going to offset that. And there's a lot more concern this time than when the original tax cuts were passed because the fiscal situation is so much worse. Our debt is now 100% of GDP. it was 75% of GDP last time around. And then what they do about the debt ceiling, when you have some members who are absolutely unwilling to lift the debt ceiling, and what's good, again, is this time around, they're also really pushing not to grow the debt by making sure that that reconciliation bill and those tax cuts are offset. But my guess is that the immigration border portion will be easier to pass. And I think they are likely to end up going back to that model of doing two separate bills. But nobody knows. Nobody knows.
Well, that's fascinating insight, though. And whether it's in one big, beautiful bill, as Donald Trump calls it, or in a later reconciliation bill, we're going to be managing the tax code here and the effort to renew the Trump tax cuts, which we've talked about a lot, and the committee has done great research on, considering the impact that it may have on our deficits. Maya, you add no tax on tips, you add no tax on overtime, Social Security, mortgage interest. I can't even remember half of them at this point. Then salt.
Get rid of salt,
add the layer of salt here for our viewers and listeners. This is going to be a much more difficult debate than it was in 2007.
It is going to be more difficult.
Or 2017, forgive me. I'll get my calendar right.
Yeah. Time has lost all meaning, hasn't it? It's so hard. But yeah, I mean, there are a lot more members this time who really feel uncomfortable with the fact that last time they passed the tax cuts, they absolutely supported the tax cuts, but they also supported spending cuts. And they did not do that. They did not include spending cuts. And in fact, under President Trump, there were 3 debt ceiling increases, all of which were paired with plans that increased spending and increased borrowing. So those fiscally conservative members are not as comfortable this time. And I think it is going to be a more difficult fight. Like you just said, they're adding more and more things to an already huge $4 or $5 trillion tax bill. They're layering on additional tax cuts when I would think the smartest way to think about this is smart pro-growth tax reform that's coupled with spending reductions or offsets. You should be paring back the least pro-growth parts of that tax bill instead of layering on new things.
You know, mentioning 2007 brings me back to a whole different period of time here. And that was, of course, the beginning of the Obama administration, 2008, healthcare reconciliation.
Yep.
When we talk about reconciliation this time around, Maya, how close to this version might we have once the Senate parliamentarian is done with this? Or will they be able to put all this policy into a budget vehicle?
That's right. As you understand, as you know, that in reconciliation, you're really only allowed to have policies that have direct budgetary impacts. And so you can't have policies that are extraneous. The parliamentarian has immense power here. I think a lot of the issues on immigration, it will be interesting to see which things can be included and which things cannot be. We heard that the Senate is going to be strictly following what the parliamentarian says. That's very important. Reconciliation is an immensely powerful tool. If they did not have that, they would be looking at bipartisan policies, which would be just completely different from what we're about to see in terms of the focus on immigration and tax cuts. And it has traditionally been used to reduce the deficit, less so recently, less so for tax cuts. And I think we're going to see some discomfort with moving in a fiscally reckless direction and certainly not abiding by those general rules. That doesn't mean we won't see gimmicks. We're going to see a lot of gimmicks. We're going to see people trying to use baselines that are made up, pretending that policies exist when they actually don't. We're going to see magical growth numbers that people are assuming, and we're probably going to end up seeing truncated tax extensions where instead of making them permanent, which is how you should do tax policy, they're going to put them in for a few years to make the cost look much lower than it actually is.
Yeah. Let's stay close on this, Maya. It's going to be an interesting year. She's president of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, Maya MacGuineas, on Bloomberg TV and radio. Coming up, how Nvidia is planning to work with the upcoming Trump administration, Bloomberg's conversation with CEO Jensen Huang. Coming up next on Balance of Power, this is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thanks for joining us. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Jensen Huang sat down with Bloomberg today following the Nvidia CEO's keynote address at the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, which focused on the future of AI, what Huang calls physical AI. Our own Ed Ludlow asked him about a number of other topics as well, including tariffs, Donald Trump, and the influence of Elon Musk. Here's part of that conversation.
I know Elon's attitude towards AI, and he's very optimistic about its future, and obviously he's working on some of the most important AI areas. XAI is working on foundation cognitive intelligence AI. Tesla's working on autonomous vehicles, and Optimus is for humanoid robotics. These three areas of AI are the three most important areas of AI, and so I think he's working on exactly the right things.
You kind of positioned AI, Nvidia's position in the supply chain for physical AI, robotics, autonomous driving. Explain it a bit more, the role you see Nvidia playing.
Well, we're a core technology company, and so we build the foundational computing platforms. We're also full stack, and so we develop the necessary algorithms, the necessary AI technologies, and then we put it out to the industry for them to adopt it and turn it into end market solutions. We're a computing platform company.
So you're on stage and you're surrounded by, I think, a dozen humanoid robots, which is nice for you. When will I be here at CES in Las Vegas and actually have...
There's some robots right down the hall.
No, but in real terms, you must have a timeline that you see real-world commercial deployment of the technology you outlined last night.
It depends on use case. I would say...
Which will we see first use case?
The first use case will probably be in manufacturing. You know, there's estimates tens, if not 100 million jobs that are workers that are... The world is short of workers. And aging population, declining birth rates, and so I think the world needs a lot more workers. Robotics is one of the best ways for us to supplement all of that and help companies recover the lost revenues on the one hand and drive productivity, which reduces inflation for the world on the other hand. And so I think robotics is going to be very important to that. In different areas, you could have, they'll probably deploy into manufacturing first because they obviously need it most.
Which you see as a ginormous potential market, addressable market.
It's a $50 trillion industry that wants to grow.
President-elect Trump has been speaking during the course of our conversation. How imperative is it that you go to Mar-a-Lago and meet with him if Nvidia is America's leading AI company? And will you?
I'd be delighted to go see him.
Have you been invited?
Not yet, but I would be delighted to go see him and congratulate him and do everything we can to help this administration succeed.
It's likely this coming administration will be as restrictive on technology export, and tariffs will be a function. How have you prepared for that, Jensen?
Whatever the administration ultimately decides, we'll give them as much insight as we can from our perspective, and I'm sure that the administration will make the right moves. That's in the best interest of our country.
That's Jensen Huang, and this is Bloomberg.
If they're not back by the time I get into office, all hell will break out in the Middle East. And it will not be good for Hamas, and it will not be good, frankly, for anyone. All hell will break out. I don't have to say anymore, but that's what it is.
Donald Trump raising the stakes on a possible hostage deal between Israel and Hamas, even with the Biden administration currently engaged in negotiations to secure the very same deal. That's where we start our conversation with Democratic Congressman Jake Auchincloss of Massachusetts, a combat Marine Corps veteran who served in the war in Afghanistan and was also deployed in Panama, where he helped to train the Panamanian public forces to combat the illegal drug trade. Clearly, we have a lot to talk about here, Congressman. I'll start with you on the matter of Israel, although we heard a lot of geopolitics from the president today, even threatening the idea of using military force to take over Greenland and the Panama Canal. He's not the president of the United States yet. He's not the commander-in-chief. So how should we be interpreting this kind of language?
As always with Trump, ignoring most of it as bluster. He has some bad ideas for foreign policy. He has some reasonable ideas for foreign policy. One of his reasonable ideas is supporting Israel and putting the pressure on Iran. Iran is on its back heels right now because the Biden administration supplied Israel with the diplomatic support and the materiel necessary for Israel to attack Iran and its proxy forces. And we should keep that pressure on so that the Ayatollah knows that he cannot fund terrorism throughout the region. Now, one of President Trump's bad ideas is threatening to invade Panama. That is reckless, and it does not make the United States look stronger. It makes us look feckless.
Well, I want to ask you about that because you actually have experience, as I mentioned, having been deployed in Panama. If my history is correct, they don't have a standing army since the U.S. invasion in the George H.W. Bush administration. There's something called the Panamanian Public Forces you were working with. What is Donald Trump talking about with regard to military tools or military force? What do you suspect the U.S. would do?
10 years ago, I commanded a combined special operations mission to Panama where Marines, sailors, and Colombian special forces trained the Panamanian public forces in how to do drug interdiction patrols on the Canal Zone and in the jungle surrounding the Canal Zone. And you're right, the public forces in Panama are sort of a combination of our National Guard and military. They are professional, they are pro-American, and threatening to do battle with them is outlandish. It is not how a great power acts. If President Trump has concerns about the Monroe Doctrine in the Western Hemisphere, if he has concerns about Chinese influence over the Canal Zone through its shipping operations on either side of the canal, make that case to Congress, try to negotiate it through diplomacy, but it would unravel key elements of international trade and norms for us to even threaten force. If we want to combat Chinese influence over shipping and ports, we should take the fight to their backyard. We should join the Trans-Pacific Partnership in the Indo-Pacific. We should expand the Development Finance Corporation, and we should be building ports and trading with countries like Indonesia or Singapore or Malaysia, countries that are in Chinese neighborhood. That is the way for us to counter their influence.
Well, the president-elect says that we need to take over Greenland and take control of the Panama Canal for economic security, he said in one reference, and national security in the other. Is this the new manifest destiny?
No, it's the typical bluster that we can all expect from Donald Trump. But I think it's important for elected officials in Washington, D.C. not to engage in an outrage Olympics every time Donald Trump opens his mouth and says something outlandish. We know that's his style, and I think we can't always take the bait. He's not even president yet. He's saying a lot of things. He's got a national security team around him between his national security advisor and his secretary of state who are reasonable people. And I think we can expect that he's going to operate within some of the guardrails that they put down. But I do think that we have to make clear as members of Congress that the United States is not going to be invading any of our Western Hemisphere neighbors, not Greenland, not Panama, not acceptable.
Got it. I want to ask you about some of the business that's about to be had in your House of Representatives. The new Congress, of course, has been sworn in, and there's a big question. It came up in Donald Trump's news conference today about sequencing, about reconciliation, how to fund the government, how to deal with the border and the Trump tax cuts. We talked earlier on Balance of Power with Republican Congressman Mike Flood of Nebraska, serves on the Financial Services Committee, and had this to say when we asked about Democratic involvement in passing that legislation.
Talking about reconciliation, obviously, if we can act as a majority in the House and our colleagues in the Senate can use the reconciliation process, this will be a very Republican-driven agenda. Now, I'm under no illusions. Outside of reconciliation, we're going to have to find bipartisan solutions. We've only got 53 votes in the Senate. There will be a number of opportunities for bipartisan agreement.
I don't know what bipartisan solutions he's referring to there, Congressman, but when it comes to this idea of using reconciliation, are Democrats taking their hands off the wheel?
Democrats aren't taking our hands off the wheel. Republicans are stiff-arming us from being co-pilots, which, one, ignores the precedent from the 118th Congress the last 2 years where, let's be real, Hakeem Jeffries was basically the co-speaker with Mike Johnson because they could never get the votes to pass anything. The bipartisan solutions that Mike Flood are talking about are teed up and ready to go. We have a bipartisan border security bill. Donald Trump torpedoed it, but it has the votes to pass. We have a bipartisan bill to lower drug prices by taking on the health insurance lobby. It was teed up and ready to go. Mike Johnson blinked at the last minute because of lobbying by the health insurance industry. We have bipartisan agreement on affordable housing tax credit expansion. I think Mike Johnson is going to find that it is a lot easier to count to 218 when you have a pool of 435 votes rather than a pool of 220 votes, especially because The bill that they want to do on a reconciliation pathway is going to explode the deficit. Giving tax cuts to wealthy people who don't need them, spending more on the border, spending more in the military, not touching Social Security or Medicare, and claiming that tariffs are going to pay for it, the arithmetic does not add up, and their fiscal hawks are going to know that.
Are they going to jam this all into one reconciliation bill and have one vote to save America, as Donald Trump and Mike Johnson say, or does this break up into different parts, Congressman? We'll be talking about it all year.
I expect we're going to be talking about this all year, and Mike Johnson and John Thune are going to be debating it. But the simple arithmetic is not just 218 and 51 in the Senate. The simple arithmetic is this bill will widen the deficit. And there are a number of Republicans, not a majority, not a plurality of them, but enough to tank this bill, who are not going to be able to defend them to themselves or to their constituents why they are adding trillions of dollars to our debt to give tax cuts to people who don't need the tax cuts. They are going to have a real problem adding to 218 with that kind of a bill. They should work with Democrats on proposals that will actually lower the federal deficit and lower costs for American families. But they don't seem to want to do that.
Well, we'll be looking forward to talking with you when you get back to Washington, Congressman. We need some help in figuring out how to shovel snow, it turns out. So come see us soon. Democratic Congressman Jake Auchincloss of Massachusetts with us on Balance of Power. Coming up, we'll take a look at Donald Trump's pitch for Greenland. Yeah, more on this as his son, Don Jr., visits Greenland today. We'll explain with our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We need Greenland for national security purposes. I've been told that for a long time, long before I even ran. I mean, people have been talking about it for a long time. You have approximately 45,000 people there. People really don't even know if Denmark has any legal right to it. But if they do, they should give it up because we need it for national security. If Denmark wants to get to a conclusion, but nobody knows if they even have any right, title, or interest. The people are going to probably vote for independence or to come into the United States. But if they did do that, then I would tariff Denmark at a very high level.
Donald Trump in his news conference today at Mar-a-Lago talking about why Denmark should give up Greenland to the U.S. if it even owns it to begin with. Joining us now, this evening's political panel. Let's dig into it. Kristen Hahn, partner at Rock Solutions and Democratic strategist, with us alongside Republican strategist Lester Munson, co-head of the international practice at BGR Group. Great to have you both with us. Lester, I don't know where to begin, but the King of Denmark does, unveiling a new royal coat of arms that more prominently features Greenland. Are we serious about this, suggesting the use of military force to take over sovereign territory, if not Canada itself?
Joe, is America ready to fight a two-front war in Greenland and Panama? That is a question national security experts are asking.
I hope not.
I think we are ready. If we had to, I think we'd do well. I don't think that's going to happen.
I don't think that's in doubt.
How realistic is the Greenland question, I think is a serious question. There's some legitimacy here. It's unclear why Denmark should have a possession in North America. I think that's a fair question. The U.S. does have national security concerns with respect to the Arctic, and Greenland is part of that concern. And as climate change, adjusts waterways, particularly in the northern hemisphere, this does become a real issue. There are national security issues. Does it require us to buy Greenland from Denmark? I'm not sure, but it's certainly an interesting issue to be discussing. Perhaps not in this way.
Okay,
but there are serious issues.
Buying it would be more polite than taking it over militarily, I think, in general, right? Kristen, he referred to the artificial line that is our northern border with Canada. And there are questions about his approach to sovereign territory. Are you taking this seriously, or are you with Jake Auchincloss, the congressman just joined us and said, don't take the bait when it comes to the outrage Olympics?
Well, and I think, if he talked about Greenland like Lester just did, I think it might sound a little bit more reasonable. But the thing is, he blusters and he threatens other sovereign countries. He does not respectful. We are not going to invade Canada. And I think, there is some truth, or a lot of truth to what Congressman Auchincloss just said, which is we tend to take the bait on every single issue that he talks about. Now, he will be president of the United States again, so you have to give some weight to what he says, obviously. But, we tend to run around and try to defend, and it's almost an impossible game to play. So, I think when you're talking about our foreign policies, I'm hopeful that there are some reasonable people that will be joining the Trump administration who can, again, like the last administration, keep him from doing just, crazy things and making statements that have real negative impacts across the globe.
Mm-hmm. Lester, Donald Trump also said that we would change the name of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. Are we at the patio on Mar-a-Lago here? Because it brings us back to the question, do you take him seriously or literally?
Well, if this were a comedy routine, I would give it an A+.
We're laughing.
There's some new material here. It resonates. People react to it. He is certainly changing the conversation that people are having about various issues. No one anticipated war with Denmark or with Panama a month ago, nor changing the name of the Gulf of Mexico, which seemed to be just fine for a long time. Now that he mentions it, people are thinking, well, maybe it should be the Gulf of America. No, I don't know that that's a serious proposal either.
Can you believe I'm asking you these questions today on international television?
No, I cannot.
You're just playing along with me, right? Your phone was ringing today. What were people telling you at BGR Group? Did you see the Trump newser?
So I think it's people are literally like half laughing and half being concerned, and I think all of us have at least a little bit of each of those.
Okay, got it.
Are we being serious about these things? It is in the grand scheme of things. Trump is talking about different issues, and he's instead of playing home games, he's playing away games. So I think there is a virtue, in a weird sense, to the thesis of some of the things he's doing. Probably the message to Hamas about the terrorists was the most important thing today, and the most serious one.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Kristen. I wonder your thoughts. When Donald Trump got into this, he actually brought his Mideast envoy, Steve Witkoff, up to the podium and asked him for an update on the hostages, which was an interesting moment, knowing that the Biden administration is engaged right now in hopes of crafting a deal for their release before Joe Biden leaves office. There's no promise that will happen. But as Donald Trump said, if they're not back by the time I get into office, all hell will break out in the Middle East. Is that appropriate for someone who's not actually the commander-in-chief? How should Joe Biden deal with that?
I mean, I certainly hope. I would assume that the president and his staff, who have been, successful in bringing people home from overseas through very difficult, intricate negotiations, but there was probably no hope that Donald Trump would respect those negotiations, even if it were to negatively impact the hostages themselves. That's very, again, blustery language that can be, I think everybody around the world is taking in what a second Trump administration would look like, and we're getting a good look at it today. And some of that language can certainly be dangerous.
What do you make of that? Should he wait for the current commander-in-chief to finish his job?
No, I think because, with all due respect to President Biden, he's not really doing the job. The political momentum has shifted to President-elect Trump, like it or not. There is an opportunity here with the change in administration to make a difference on an issue like the hostages. Mm-hmm. This is a real opportunity. Mm-hmm. Witness what happened in 1980.
That's what he thinks is
in 1981,
happen here,
when Reagan took over, the hostages in Iran were released as he was being sworn in. I think that's what Trump is looking for here. And if there's a chance that is successful, he ought to seize it. I have no problem with that whatsoever.
Is that how this ends, Kristen, on Inauguration Day?
I mean, everybody wants these hostages to come home. So, if that is something that could be in the cards, I think there's not an American out there who wouldn't want that to be the end. What happens on Inauguration Day, I think that's yet to be seen.
When he says all hell will break out in the Middle East, what does that look like?
Well, again,
that's a warning to Hamas, presumably?
It's a warning to Hamas. It's a warning to Iran. It's a warning probably to the new government in Syria, which is thinking about which direction it's going to go in the next 6 to 12 months. There's a lot of important messages here. And Trump, now he doesn't have to be specific about his plans. He can leave these questions open. So why not go ahead and do that? That does maximize his leverage. So I do think there's a method to the madness here, as silly as like the Gulf of America might sound, and some of these other things. There is a method to let's have some bluster. Let's speak strongly. Let's have a different approach and let people react and then kind of see where we go from there.
There's the matter of pardons, Kristen Hahn, I want to ask you about, and it's not so much the ones that Joe Biden might be about to make on his way out. Donald Trump is expected to deliver pardons on his way in, and he was asked about the January 6 offenders today, specifically violent offenders. He said we will be making, quote, major pardons, unquote, once he takes office. What's about to happen here?
I mean, he said all along that he plans to pardon the January 6 offenders. He keeps calling that day, which I think should be offensive to any American, a day of love. It certainly wasn't. These people committed crimes and should be held accountable for them. But, I have every expectation that the president, will look to pardon them. However, what is going to be the political blowback for something like that? I'm not sure. It's certainly something that his base is looking for, but it will be big news.
Just quickly, would there be blowback for pardoning someone who assaulted a police officer?
I think there would be. I agree with Kristen on this. I think it'd be a wildly unpopular move. And inappropriate and arguably offensive, depending on some of the details here. There might be a few people whose sentences were excessive and he can act on that. Yeah. Okay, fine. But if it's a broad pardon of everyone who was involved, I think that's absolutely wrong.
We've got a great panel today. Lester Munson, Kristen Hahn, they'll be back with us as members of Congress pay their final respects to President Jimmy Carter, his body lying in state, as you see a live view of the U.S. Capitol Rotunda. There's more next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thanks for joining us. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, where former President Jimmy Carter's body is lying in state in the U.S. Capitol. A live view of the rotunda right now, where a memorial service is just wrapping up now, and soon the public will be allowed to file through the rotunda to pay respects. This after his remains arrived earlier today from the Carter Presidential Center in Atlanta, where it had been since Saturday. Back with us now, our political panel, Kristen Hahn and Lester Munson. It does appear that lawmakers are now making their way through the rotunda to pay respects here. Kristen, this is a special moment, and as we mentioned earlier in the broadcast, it's something that Washington does very well. How should we be thinking of Jimmy Carter here as Joe Biden prepares to wind down his administration and the parallels that many have drawn between the two?
I mean, you think about the legacies and the legacy of the man, not just the legacy of his presidencies. When you have presidencies, there are highs and there are lows. And, we look at all of those together. But when you look at how much he accomplished, even after, well after he left the White House, it's really remarkable. And how you hear people talk about, and his son talking about how he so valued the individual and each individual person. And, and was such a religious man that it was just deep into his core. And I think that we all felt it.
It's really special watching Jimmy Carter's remains arrive today at the Navy Memorial on Pennsylvania Avenue. The horse-drawn caisson, the riderless horse delivering him to the rotunda, pulls us out of the news cycle for a moment following that news conference earlier today.
Yeah, and Jimmy Carter, again, I agree with Kristen wholeheartedly. As a man, as the work he did after he left the White House, he created the Carter Center, which promoted democracy around the world, really kind of created a whole new way of the U.S. dealing with the developing world in a really positive way. He did some amazing things. Like, he couldn't happen today. This was a guy who was a born-again Christian, who was also a huge fan of the Allman Brothers Band and followed them around.
They helped get him elected.
He was a peanut farmer. He went to the Naval Academy. It was kind of amazing life. And whatever you may think of some of his policies, this is a guy who lived to be 100. He had the highest office in the land. He accomplished some really terrific things while he was president, including the Camp David Accords, and then even more amazing things after he left.
Well, that's for sure, and well-spoken, Lester, with a live view that we will leave you with from the U.S. Capitol Rotunda. Senators are making their way past the casket of Jimmy Carter. with quite a bit of history at play here in the nation's capital today. Lester Muntz and Kristen Hahn, thank you for a great panel and a great conversation. A quick note, be sure to tune into our special coverage this Thursday of President Jimmy Carter's state funeral here in Washington. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.